Kia ora, EDUC 322. This lecture is on the development of multi-ethnic relationships in education. As we know through our journey in understanding multicultural or multi-ethnic education, the notion of multicultural education has evolved around the world, particularly in the United States, and the extent to which its involvement has occurred in Aotearoa New Zealand is largely questionable, because we are still at a place where we are trying to conceptualize and understand it in terms of our ethnic groups, our cultural groups in society. So we will see that definitions of multicultural education across the world vary, and these vary between scholars, educators, and practitioners. And their definitions will basically vary according to the needs and the differences in contexts. These needs and differences are essentially about how people work together, live together, operate together, look at each other in terms of their differences and similarities. Education, of course, is a driver of society, and as a society is also a driver of education. In terms of variances in multicultural education, there can be, I suppose, what you would say, some shifts in curriculum. So this could be a key example of a variance in multicultural education, and that shift could be as simple as adding some new materials and perspectives, which could include traditionally underrepresented groups. In Aotearoa New Zealand, this could mean, or could be an example of including Samoan history in the social studies curriculum. It could be including the Māori land wars in the curriculum subject of history, for example. But this, of course, will depend on the school. It will depend on leadership in terms of the Board of Trustees, the principal, teachers, and the resources that are available to them. For example, these resources might be the people resources, it could be the financial resources, and it could also be about attitudes towards what we value in society as multicultural or multi-ethnic education. Other variances in multicultural education could include where people or schools or institutions and organizations focus on institutional and systemic issues, and these might be about testing, examinations, funding resources, or in a overseas context, tracking. So where people are interested at looking at some of the more complicated issues of understanding and recognizing the challenges for underrepresented groups, whether they're gender issues, whether there are ethnic issues, whether the groups are underrepresented, and what that means for those groups in terms of their educational progress. Another variance in multicultural education is where people look at education change as being part of a larger societal transformation. So this is where we are looking at the statement that I've referred to in the past, how education is a mirror of society and society is a mirror of education, where if we look at something positive in terms of a positive change in education, we are looking at positive change in society, so that we explore, we criticize, we negotiate the tensions of oppression in terms of the world, and we look at in a more critical sense how education has served to maintain the status quo, such as white privilege, or in other contexts, white supremacy, the global socioeconomic conditions, and exploitation. So we then question, for example, in multicultural or multi-ethnic education, is who does the education system serve best? Is it privileging one ethnic or one cultural group over another? These are fundamental questions that we can ask. So therefore, some discussions and approaches will of course focus on micro approaches. So when we talk about micro approaches, we're talking about specifically, for example, teaching methods, what we can attend to within a smaller subcontext, in a classroom, in a unit, in a tutorial group, for example, at university. And then there'll be other foci or attention given to macro. The macro system is the cultural beliefs. And if some of us are or have taken human development, where we are more familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological system work, we are really focused in on the macro system of culture, of values, of belief systems, and ideologies. And so therefore, the variances in discussions on multicultural or multi-ethnic education could be micro or it could be macro. But there are some, I suppose, middle grounds or agreements that the educators do come together on in terms of multicultural education. And that is usually that they believe every student has an equal opportunity to achieve to their full potential. Whatever this equal opportunity is, of course, is up for debate, and how that is played out in policy and in an institution is dependent as well. But that also every student is prepared to competently participate in an increasingly intercultural society. So multicultural education has the equal opportunity element and the competent participation in an increasing intercultural society. And also another agreement that multicultural educators across the world come to is that teachers must be prepared to facilitate learning for every individual student, no matter how different they are or how similar they are from the teacher themselves and from one another. So there are 3 fundamental agreements on this slide. And the agreements is that schools are active in this process as active agents, as participants to end oppression of all types. So they end oppression within their own school units, their own school organizations, within their own walls, within their own classrooms. And then another goal or agreement is that they are producing socially and critically active and aware students for society and for their schools, whether that is through the teaching, the curriculum, through extracurricular activities, or through inclusion of family and community with schools. So they also agree that education must be fully student-centered rather than teacher-centered, and include the voices and experiences of the students within their context. Very important element of multicultural education. They also agree that educators, activists, and others have to take a more active role in re-examining educational practices. Educational practices can be very broad in this way of teaching and learning. So it doesn't have to just be about the teaching in the classroom, but it could be the actual interrelationships that exist within the school context, within the family unit, and with the community, and how this affects the learning of all students. So this is taking on more of a holistic approach to looking at multicultural education. So we're looking at assessment methods, pedagogies, which is teaching and learning, school psychology and counselling practices, educational materials and textbooks, and so on. Now let's go back to Paul Gorski, who we attended to in the previous lecture. Multicultural education is a progressive approach for transforming education that holistically critiques and responds to discriminatory policies and practices in education. It is grounded in ideals of social justice, education equity, critical pedagogy, and a dedication to providing educational experiences in which all students reach their full potentials as learners and as socially aware and active beings locally, nationally, and globally. Multicultural education acknowledges that schools are essential to laying the foundation for the transformation of society and the elimination of injustice. So, major point by Gorski is that education is a response, is an answer, is a leader in changing an approach to understanding peoples, and that these peoples, whoever we are, whoever they are, is about transforming society, and that we are aware of the challenges of educational equity, of justices, of injustices, and that we can contribute to the world in acknowledging people as being diverse peoples and including them in the system and their needs, so that our local systems, our national systems, and our global systems appreciate people more deeply. Paul Gorski attends to one of the underlying goals of multicultural education is to affect social change. So the social change essentially starts with the self. And as we looked at our first assignment, we started with ourself. It is the transformation of self. It is the knowing of self. It is the transformation of schools and schooling, and the transformation of society. So this is I suppose a simplified way of looking at some of Paul Gorski's critique of education, is that we start with ourselves, and then we look at the schools, and then we transform society as well. Sounds simple, but essentially very difficult. So the transformation of self. If we think about ourselves becoming educators, whether we are educators in a school system or in the community, or we become immersed in policy, we are still going to be some type of educator. As a parent, we are educators. As a brother or a sister or a cousin, we are educators. So we could say in the most broadest sense that we have responsibilities to engage in critical and continual processes to look at how our own socializations and biases have informed our position in the world, our own teaching, our own expressions of life, and how this has affected the educational experiences of my students or the people around me. Okay, so again, we go back to ourselves and we look at how we have come to be who we are. How were we socialized? Through our family, through our peer groups, through our schools, through our experiences in communities. And how does this influence the way we relate to other people in the world? So Gorski will say, I have a responsibility to myself to examine the lenses through which I understand the people and happenings around me. So again, a constant self-examination and reflection to see where we have come from and to acknowledge that. He states that only when I have a sense for how my own perceptions are developed in relation to my life experiences will I begin to understand the world and effectively navigate my relationships with the people around me. So again, how do my life experiences shape my perspective? How does this impact on my relationships with the people around me? He also states that I also have a responsibility to my students to work toward eliminating my prejudices, examining who is and who is not being reached by my teaching, my relationships, and my relearning how my identity affects their learning experiences. To be an effective multicultural educator, I must be in a constant process of self-examination and transformation. So we can see that the self, as the person in the world, as the teacher, as the educator, has a very important role in terms of transformation, and that this is a constant process, and it's a fluid process, and it doesn't just stop at the time you reach university, for example, or when you get a job. It is a constant. To be an effective multicultural educator, I must be in a constant process of self-examination and transformation. And this is not just about being involved in a professional development program and ticking the box and saying, well, yeah, okay, I've done my multicultural education, I've done my self-reflection, what now? But instead, how do we encourage our educators, ourselves, to be in this constant flow? And for me, it's an important point. I usually start each day reflecting on the previous day, but also who I am. I reflect on some of my, I suppose, my inner voices, if I've been more judgmental or more discriminative or less sympathetic to a particular news story. And so I'm really constantly examining my own views so that I don't inflict these on other people. I'm careful to listen and to be patient in terms of this listening to myself and to others. So if we're looking at the transformation of schools and schooling, we attend to the student-centered pedagogy. And we know that in universities, for example, if we look at a lecture room, one of those atypical lecture rooms, for example, at Maclaurin Lecture Theatre, where the lecturer is standing up the front, and then we have rows and rows of chairs and tables, of course, going up the lecture theatre. But that essentially is a teacher-centered pedagogy in terms of the actual physical classroom, for example, because when you are standing at the lectern, you can see every movement, you can see every person essentially in terms of their discussions with other people or being on a cell phone. That's a very teacher-centered type of lecture room. So we need to look at the experiences of students to be part and an integral part of the classroom, making the learning active so that the lecturer or the teacher is not just standing up in the front without discussion, without debate, without a reciprocal relationship, and that teaching and learning has to be interactive, relevant, and engaging, and that any of our traditional teaching approaches in the past and pedagogical models have to be deconstructed. They have to be stripped back to examine how these previous approaches have continued to contribute to and support institutional systems of oppression or racism or discrimination. And that we have to acknowledge and recognize that oppressive practices like tracking or streaming, or monitoring, over-monitoring of achievement levels. If we remember the national government a few years back bringing in standardized levels that schools had to obtain for particular learners. And this was seen as an extremely horrid approach for some schools because you started putting people in boxes if they didn't reach a particular standard, and without taking into account some of the macro challenges or some of the socioeconomic challenges in our schools. So, in terms of transformation of schools and schooling in multicultural education, aspects of teaching and learning must be refocused on, rededicated to, for the students themselves, instead of standardized test scores and school rankings. That we look at individuals as learners, students as learners, and we acknowledge their backgrounds. We bring these into the classroom. We appreciate their diversities and complexities. And that we place emphasis on critical thinking, learning skills, relating to society, and having a deeper social awareness as well as the facts and figures. And so that we are operating with society and not separate from society. So that pedagogy must provide all students with the opportunity to reach their potential as learners, as citizens of the country, with their identities fully intact. Curriculum. Now, this is quite a big document in New Zealand, of course, but we must analyze this curriculum for accuracy and completeness, so that when we are looking at the subjects that are represented or taught in schools, from primary through to college and even at university, that they represent diverse perspectives, and that these diverse perspectives are related to accuracy and completeness. So, for example, Pacific history being written by Pacific people, researched by Pacific people, Māori perspectives by Māori for Māori. Inclusive curriculum means including the voices of the students in the classroom, so that they are the co-designers of their learning and teaching. They are the co-designers of the curriculum. And that we are critical of educational media and materials that are presented to us, whether they are the textbooks, whether they are the even the school newsletters, whether they are the material that is in posters on our walls, that these materials include diverse voices and perspectives, and that students are encouraged to think critically about materials and media that is in front of them. Whose voices are they hearing? Whose voices are they not hearing? What is the bias this author may bring to their writing? Okay, and so we are consciously infusing our teaching and learning experiences with this more critical narrative for learners to question society, to question what is in front of them, to question what they are learning. Teachers must be better prepared to foster positive classroom climates for all students. So this is the supportive school and classroom environment, where we look at the school cultures. We look at what is being generated, what is being cycled through the school system that support oppressive societal conditions, and that we aim to remove these in multicultural education. That we acknowledge that people's identities, languages, ways of being are necessary for our schools. Because we can't have statements, for example, where people will say, oh, we only teach Māori to Māori. What about others that need to be learning about Māori history or Māori language for the embetterment of our country, for the embetterment of the world, essentially, is when we understand each other in a more deeper relationship, in deeper ways, then we will be able to transcend some of our differences that are between us, that are the wars between us. And the administrative hierarchies in schools have to also be examined. Who holds positions of power in our schools? Are there Māori? Are there Pasifika in deputy principal, in principalships? Are they represented in boards of trustees across this country? Who makes the decisions? So we are again questioning who holds the power, who holds the knowledge in our systems. In terms of evaluation and assessment, this is another important area to refocus on and re-examine, and that we question and we examine the emphasis, for example, on these very common words that we will see in education, such as achievement, ability, or potential. We will hear these words being thrown around in our school systems, at university, but essentially what are they talking about? Is achievement about A grades? Is ability about good or bad? Or is potential about the potential or lack of potential? Okay, so again, questioning how these terms are represented in our school systems, and who who has defined these terms. So that achievement or success, for example, could be about actually bringing in families or communities into schools. Maybe that is about achievement or success for some communities, or that it is about learning about society. Maybe that is about the potential for our school. So that we continue to evaluate and reevaluate how to measure success. So we know that success is a very loaded term, whether it is in business, whether it is in education. But what does this term success mean for Pasifika, for Māori, for Asian, for LGBTIQ society groupings? And how do our new programs, our existing programs, provide more deeper enrichment of these types of successes for groups that are traditionally and presently underrepresented in colleges and universities? There is a very interesting article out at the moment in the media about Māori and Pasifika and rural communities being admitted into medical degrees, and how that is a notion of equity. And so you will have two camps that will say, well, no, we need Māori, Pasifika, and people in rural communities just to be admitted on their own academic achievement levels. And if they don't make the cut, well, then they're not good enough to be doctors. But then you have the other camp who will say, well, no, they are actually underrepresented groups in the medical profession, and so we need to create the space, we need to create the resourcing, we need to create equity for Māori, Pasifika, and people from rural communities in the medical profession. The transformation of society is one of the biggest goals of multicultural education. So ultimately the goal is to contribute to the transformation of society and to the application and maintenance of social justice and equity. Imagine where we had a school who were critical and thinking about society and how they were thinking about teaching and learning in this way that brought a new narrative to looking at the world. And one of my dear colleagues in the United States in Philadelphia has formed the Revolution School, where he has broken down the borders between school and community. And so the students do their learning at school, for example, but they also are learning in community with community about injustices, about building a new world, about learning in the community, because essentially we are community members. Schools are parts of communities. And so that we are fostering a more connected relationship between what we learn in school and the real world. So the transformation of society stands to reason as the transformation of schools necessarily transforms a society that puts so much stock in educational attainment, degrees, and test scores. So how do we ensure that our schools can transform a society that weighs so much achievement and measurement on degrees, on achievement of success, of A's, of A pluses, of high grade point averages, without taking into account some of the cultural strengths, from the deeper cultural strengths that people bring with them? A very challenging point. The problems in education are themselves symptoms of a system that continues to be controlled by the economic elite. We are always critical about how educational decisions are made. Who makes these decisions? Is it centralized by the Business Roundtable? Is it made to advantage a particular group in society, or privilege a particular group in society? In the latest budget from the New Zealand government, we can see a shift in the re-education and the retraining of New Zealand society into vocational, into trades, into more community-based education, more adult education. So if you look at the budget in more depth, you will see this paradigm shift happening in the ideology that education essentially is not just about economics. And it's really a fascinating way to re-examine what we're doing in education in this course, but also see it occurring in society currently because of COVID-19. Schools consistently provide continuing privilege to the privileged and continuing struggle for the struggling with very little hope of upward mobility. We can see this across the world, we can see it in this country, and that we have to make sure that this is not going to be part of our narrative for specific groups such as Māori, such as Pasifika. And that while only the terminology, for example, culturally responsive pedagogy, diversity, inclusive practices has changed, the practices are not quite as overt. We still have to be critical about our practices in Aotearoa New Zealand in terms of our curriculum, in terms of our teacher education, our professional development, our teaching and learning resources, and in our leadership, so that we are able to foster more of a multi-ethnic, a more of a multicultural approach to education that is fundamentally represented in resourcing and policy and curriculum and our teachers and our leadership, and a more holistic approach to change. I am a great believer in a whole system change, and that's largely due to seeing so much lack of change in the past and currently for some of our groups in society who still experience low levels of educational achievement. Educators, educational theorists, researchers, activists, and everyone else must continue to practice and apply interculturalism teaching and learning principles both inside and out of the classroom. Okay, so the relationships between people, the narratives, the dialogues, the debates, the discussions have to be included in the classroom, but also beyond, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in the staff room, in the universities, outside of the universities, on television, on social media, on news. And so it is a continual process that this is a narrative that has to occur. Whether we are at that stage in this country is very difficult to say. My own personal perspective is interculturalism, multiculturalism in terms of education is substandard. I think there are good intentions, and there are institutions and communities and schools that try, and that in some schools, for example, that have very high Pasifika population or very high Māori populations, that you will see this just part of the natural discourse of the day. However, where we have more schools that are ethnically diverse and different socioeconomic groups, it is less likely to see multiculturalism and multi-ethnic and interculturalism in total action. And we have to see, I think, from personal perspective, more revolution in this area. And I'm wondering in the future, depending on the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we will be looking to a more localized approach to village-oriented types of schools, to smaller school systems, more regionally based school systems that really appreciate interculturalism in a deeper way. And in the transformation of society, we must not allow the knowledge that the vast majority of schools are well-intentioned lead us to assume that our schools are immune to the oppression and inequities of society. Okay, so very strong point there. Schools that are well-intentioned could lead us to assume that our schools are immune to the oppression and inequities of societies. This is such a key point in terms of the transformation of society. We have to be clear, we have to understand, and we have to acknowledge that it is not all a bed of roses for everybody. We must ask the unaskable questions. We must explore and deconstruct structures of power and privilege that maintain the status quo. And as university students that operate in communities, this is going to be one of your biggest tasks, I believe, in the coming years. Ultimately, social justice and equity in schools can and should mean social justice and equity in society. And when that happens, then the purpose of multicultural education can be fully achieved. Again, the mirror of education, the mirror of schools together, that if we start in one place, we can start to remove the injustices and inequities that are operating. Education has such a strong role in society, and the education is not just about the education in our school systems as a formal school system, but the education that occurs between relationships between people, between acknowledging the self in society, and how that can lead to a transformation just through conversation, just through a more critical argument, through a stronger narrative with neighbors, with community, with family members. Or is the mountain too steep to climb? Will we still have groups in society that are not able to function as who they are, that they will be oppressed, that they will experience injustices, racism, challenges in society because of what is happening in our schooling system or between peoples in the society? I would hope the mountain's not too steep to climb, that university students like yourselves become the critical minds, become the paradigm shifters, the ones that step up for those who are voiceless, and to challenge the status quo, because that's what we need.